Vivian carefully made her way through the bushes of the garden, hoping to remain unnoticed. The girl was sure that there was no one here and she would be able to escape. Perhaps this was the best moment to get out of here as quickly as possible. But suddenly someone called out to her and asked what Vivian was doing here. The girl turned around and realized with annoyance that she had been noticed. He was the second prince of the Astaroth Empire, the Grand Duke of the North, Aslan Rejef, famous for his cold and cruel disposition. Everyone in the area called him more of a beast than a man. The young man approached Vivian and said that if she decided to go for a walk, she could invite him and they could do it together. The girl tried to come up with a reason for her departure so as not to arouse any suspicions in the prince. Vivian had foreseen this situation. She knew that this could happen, so she had prepared an excuse in advance. The girl took out an envelope and said that she had received an urgent letter from her sister. Aslan looked at Vivian closely and replied that, as far as he knew, she was not that close to her sister, so it all seemed strange to him. He looked at the envelope and then back at the girl and asked since when the crown prince had become her sister. Vivian had already regretted 100 times that she had not examined the envelope more carefully, and now she had to somehow get out of this awkward situation. After all, the letter was from Hans, the crown prince, who was currently at odds with Aslan. But at that moment the prince suddenly approached Vivian, which the girl did not expect. Aslan reached out and snatched the envelope from the girl. The young man tore the letter into small pieces in an instant. Vivian was completely perplexed when she heard that it didn't matter who sent the letter now, and that such things were best thrown away. Aslan came very close to the girl and invited her to go with him to the bedroom. After all, as far as he remembers, she promised to spend time with him today. And then Vivian suddenly covered her mouth with her hand and coughed violently. When the prince asked if everything was okay, the girl replied that she had just felt a little chilly. Aslan hugged the girl and said that now was not the time to be sick and that she needed to return to the bedroom where she could rest, because very soon they would become real spouses. The prince added that he was sure that Vivian wanted this too, but the girl remained silent, and barely noticeable tears appeared in her eyes. It was a failure, she failed to escape, and Vivian was in complete despair. But she found herself in this situation simply because of one incorrectly written will. Even during her lifetime, Vivian read the book The Curse of Astaroth and did not even suspect that after a fatal accident, she would become a hostage of this novel. The plot was this: the descendants of the hero who defeated the demon suffer from a curse that turns them into demonic beasts. Aslan Rejef Astaroth is the main character of the novel, and he too was not spared from this curse. And despite the fact that he was born in human form, he was destined to transform into a black lion. Moreover, his bride, unaware of his curse, was obsessed only with Aslan's power and beauty. Her name was Vivian, and it was her body that the unfortunate girl ended up in. But if everything goes according to the novel's plot, Aslan will fall in love with his half-sister Vivian, who is supposed to become the main character. And then the enraged Vivian, in a fit of jealousy, will try to harm her sister. And after that he will meet his end at the hands of Aslan Rejef. Luckily, the girl was reborn before the prince was supposed to meet the main character. She accepted this fate and decided to live quietly, and when the time comes, she will congratulate Aslan and the main character on their love. But there was an important detail that was not mentioned in the original novel. Vivian was dying from a terrible disease, consumption. She had worked so hard to find a new life, but she didn't know that it would be time-limited. Unfortunately, there was no one around for the sick girl. All she had was an inherited fortune and a year to live. And Vivian decided to simply live the rest of her life in abundance, spending her fortune however she wanted. The girl decided to take a desperate step and run away, and it was then that she made that very will. Vivian intended to change her identity, and by the time the will was found, she would no longer be alive. No one will stop her from spending the rest of her life alone at one of the best resorts. Vivian decided that everyone would be better off without the villain and bequeathed her property and rights to the estate to her fiancé, Aslan. But her journey began with a meeting with bandits who demanded that she give up everything that was in the cart. But Vivian didn't even consider this unpleasantness a difficulty. The girl calmly said that she was unlucky, but not hers, but the robbers. She resolutely took out her weapon and courageously prepared to defend herself. The girl's brave act made the bandits laugh. They considered this attempt commendable, but useless. But they didn't know one thing: Vivian was the daughter of the best military family in the empire. Having dealt with the robbers, the girl was overcome by a severe cough due to overexertion. but the crying she heard made her forget about her illness. The sound seemed to be coming from the house, which, oddly enough, was located in the depths of the forest. When Vivian opened the door, the crying became much louder, which meant that someone was in the house. The girl walked up to some box and threw off the blanket. What she saw next both frightened and surprised Vivian. It was a huge lion, locked in a cage, and he was also badly injured. The next second their gazes met, and Vivian couldn't help but recognize those golden eyes. These were Aslan's eyes. The girl couldn't understand how he could end up here, especially in such a guise. Vivian frantically began to remember the plot of the novel. Perhaps she could find a clue. But in the novel, this was not the case. Perhaps everything changed because she acted in a way that was not in accordance with the plot. Vivian took the axe standing by the wall and said that it would be unpleasant if the prince died in the form of a speechless beast. Swinging her arm, she added that in return, Aslan should let her go and not hinder her departure. The lock came off its hinges, the cage opened, and the beast was released. The next minute, Vivian felt that something was wrong. The black lion began to slowly approach the girl, saliva flowing from its mouth along its sharp fangs. The girl, afraid that the beast might eat her, wanted to step back, but she stumbled and fell to the floor. The next moment, the open mouth of a hungry predator flashed right in front of her face. But let's go back a little to Alan Rejeff's mansion. The prince sat in his office and carefully read the document he had found. The will was addressed to him, and Aslan recognized Vivian's handwriting without a doubt. She wrote that her departure would be the best outcome for everyone, and asked her not to wait or look for her. The will also stated that Vivian would transfer all of her property and lands to her fiancé, His Highness Aslan. The prince was perplexed and angry at the same time. Could this piece of paper really interfere with his work and ruin his mood? The butler standing nearby said that this was not just a piece of paper, it was an important document. He added that perhaps the woman just wants to attract attention. It was only at this moment that Aslan learned that Lady Vivian was sick with tuberculosis. Dvoretsky said this information came from the girl's attending physician. Her condition had reached a critical point, and nothing could be done. Perhaps due to shock, Vivian acts like a completely different person. Aslan was silent for a moment, then stood up and ordered the butler to burn the will immediately before the emperor found out about it. But it turned out that the will had already been made public, and an investigation had begun regarding the will left behind. Aslan slammed his fist on the table with all his might. If the emperor knew about the will, then it had already reached Crown Prince Hans. Now this is a big problem because Hans will not leave it like this. Alan ordered that this woman be found immediately so that everything could be sorted out. If Vivian is still alive, she must be brought to the palace, otherwise the prince wants to see her body. Aslan was determined and ready to put on the most pathetic performance. The next morning, the prince said that it would be safer if he himself took part in the search for Vivian. He was told that it was the rainy season and it was dangerous, but Aslan didn't want to listen. The prince abruptly turned his horse towards the forest and ordered him to wait at the foot of the mountain. He walked through the forest and listened. With such a weak body, Vivian could not go far. Aslan began to see people in hoods who silently followed him. He realized that these were Hans's people. They probably want to interfere, but if they even try to get close, they will be turned into pieces of meat. And then he heard a voice that called him by name. Aslan's mind became clouded and he felt like he was starting to lose consciousness. After a few seconds, some memories from the past began to surface in his head. The prince recalled the moment when he told Vivian about his decision to break off the engagement. He said that she would never take the place of the Grand Duchess. The girl tried to stop Aslan, but he didn't even turn around and headed towards the exit. Vivian began to cough violently from excitement and anxiety. And the next second, drops of blood fell onto the carpet. Aslan didn't understand why they were showing him these memories. Was it really to make him feel guilty for Vivian's fate? He asked if this something really wanted to plunge not only his body, but also his soul into despair. The voice said that the prince would regret this day forever. All these events happened before Vivian tried to free the Black Lion. The girl fainted from the loud roar, and Aslan wondered if it was she who had locked him in the cage. The prince was tormented by the question of how the girl ended up here and why she did this to him. Then Aslan saw a broken lock on the floor and realized that Vivian had nothing to do with it. It turns out that the girl saved him and freed him from the locked cage. But Vivian saw the prince in this guise, and he could not leave it like that. Astaroth's curse was a terrible secret, and he had no choice but to dispose of the body right here. Thoughts were confused in his head, to kill or to help survive in exchange for saving him. The black lion carefully took the girl's unconscious body. He couldn't let her die here alone. Besides, she was still his bride. The weather was finally fine. Luckily, there was a large cave nearby. Vivian, without opening her eyes, heard the sound of rain, but she did not feel cold. On the contrary, her whole body was enveloped in an incomprehensible warmth that was cozy and soft. The girl opened her eyes and almost screamed from fear and horror. The defenseless girl was alone and unarmed in a dark cave next to a huge black lion. A minute later, Vivian came to her senses, quietly stroked the sleeping lion and called him by his name, Aslan. The girl could not understand how she ended up with her fiancé in such a strange place. And then she felt that her palm was wet and sticky. Vivian looked at her hand and saw blood. But this blood did not belong to the girl. Aslan was wounded. And outside the cave, the heavy rain continued to rage. After a couple of minutes, Vivian managed to bandage the black lion's wound with difficulty. She checked again that the bandage was tight. It was good that the animal was sleeping, because he couldn't strain himself now. Vivian wondered who could have done this to Aslan, and that it was unlikely that one could get used to such wounds. The beast did not eat her, but even brought her to a safe place. Vivian gently touched the sleeping lion and quietly said thank you. The next second, the beast woke up and looked at the girl. Vivian tried to look over the lion's body to see if there were any more wounds on it, and then it seemed to her that she noticed something on the beast's chest. It was a sign similar to a pentagram, only inverted, but it didn't look like the original seal. But now it didn't matter. The main thing was that there were no more wounds on the lion's body. Vivian wanted to explore the cave and asked the beast to wait for her here. But the lion stood up, and the girl realized that he wanted to go with her. The girl realized that it would be safer in the end, and they went to explore the cave together. After some time, Vivian noticed a bright glow ahead and headed towards it. On the stone floor was inscribed a pentagram very similar to the one on the body of the black lion. The girl felt like she had seen this sign before, and then she realized where they were. This was the place where the main character and Aslan met in the original novel. That day, a strong storm caught them both by surprise, and they had to wait out the bad weather, spending a passionate night together. After this, a bright red seal appeared on their chests, which connected their hearts. Thanks to this seal, Aslan could maintain human consciousness even while in the form of a beast. But the question was why she was here, and not the main character. And at that moment, Vivian wanted to leave this place, because she was not the one who should be here. She felt awkward and rushed towards the exit. And then she remembered that somewhere in this cave there was a magical instrument. Suddenly the girl heard human voices and carefully looked outside. The strangers in robes said that they must capture him alive as the crown prince had ordered. Vivian realized that these people were looking for Aslan Rejef. The girl quickly returned to the black lion and shouted that he needed to leave immediately, that they were being hunted. But the beast did not listen. On the contrary, he jumped out to meet the enemy and accepted the fight. Vivian noticed with horror that, due to the sudden movements, Aslan's wound began to bleed again. And then she saw how, because of the noise, stones began to fall from the cliff, and a plan immediately came to her mind. To attract attention, the girl loudly shouted at the strangers, asking how dare they mock the poor wounded animal. If they don't stop, she will find a way to deal with them and complain to the emperor. The people in robes didn't understand where this crazy woman came from, but they knew there shouldn't be any witnesses. The strangers rushed towards her to kill her, and Vivian was ready. A little more, and people will run up to the very entrance of the cave. One of them was already very close and swung to cut the girl into pieces. Vivian calculated everything, and at the right moment gave a strong tug on the rope she had prepared in advance. A multitude of stones and rock fragments fell down directly on the people in robes. Those who were buried by the collapse were still trying to call their comrades for help. Right before Aslan's eyes, Vivian's silhouette disappeared among a pile of debris and dust. He looked at the mountain of stones, and this time seemed like an eternity to him. Suddenly, Aslan thought he noticed some movement in silhouette. Vivian managed to survive. She managed to hide in the cave before the collapse began. Fortunately, the inside of the cave was not damaged. Once outside, the girl saw that the two strangers were still trying to carry out the order given to them. She instantly drew her sword and shouted that their death would be quick and painless. After what happened, the strangers no longer knew what to expect from this mad woman and rushed out of the forest. Vivian shouted something after the panties when she suddenly began to cough violently. The girl dropped her sword and fell exhausted to the ground. Blood, that damned blood again. Everything swam before her eyes, and she could barely make out the blurry silhouette of a black lion. Of course, she was prepared for death and even wrote a will, but she did not want to part with her life so stupidly in this place. But it looks like this was the end, and it needs to be accepted with dignity. Vivian no longer felt Aslan's warm hand touch her cheek. She didn't even feel how the young man, wet from the rain, carefully took her into his arms. Aslan felt guilty that Vivian had gone so far, but the Vivian he knew was different, obsessed with power rather than love, thinking only of her own well-being. Aslan could not find an explanation for what had happened to Vivian. Why did she stay with him in the cave, and where did she get the compassion when she bandaged his wound? It would have been easier for him if Vivian had been like before. Then she would not have caught his eye, and he would not have wanted to get closer to her now. Vivian opened her eyes. She couldn't understand where she was or how she got there. Looking around, the girl saw a huge, luxurious bedroom, decorated with gold and expensive materials. The first thing that came to her mind was that she died and went to heaven. To avoid waking Vivian, Aslan quietly listened to the doctor, who said that there was no cure for this disease. The girl's illness is so advanced that at best she will live another year. Aslan was annoyed. He didn't want to hear this from the best doctor in the south. Vivian overheard the conversation and, to prevent a scandal, tried to stop Aslan. Aslan, seeing that the girl had woken up, could not believe his eyes. The prince leaned over her, and Vivian asked what had happened and where she was. Aslan replied that she was in his mansion in the south. She needed to rest and not worry about anything. He added that the conditions here are not entirely ideal, but when Vivian recovers, they will immediately move to the capital. And already in the capital they will hold a lavish wedding, as planned. Before Vivian had time to come to her senses, she received news that shocked her. She did not understand what kind of wedding they were talking about. The girl tried to object and sat up abruptly, but the prince told her to lie down so that she could recover faster. Aslan added that he knew how much she had been waiting for this event, and that it would finally happen. The prince said that he would handle all the complicated procedures himself. Vivian only had to sign the document. The girl took the sheet of paper and began to read the text carefully. At the end, she had to put her signature where it was written, Vivian Eleanor Astaroth. But this is impossible. It contradicts the plot. What will happen to the main character then? Besides, she made a will precisely to avoid getting involved in anything, but everything only got worse. In the original, Aslan hated Vivian, so why is he so gentle with her now? The prince seemed to hear her thoughts and said that now she would not be alone. He would always be there to take care of her. All these contradictions did not fit into Vivian's head. It seemed that there was only one reason for the marriage. Aslan knows that Vivian has become aware of his weak spot, the curse of the Astaroth family. And that is why the prince wants to keep her close, to watch over her and control her. The girl understood that she should not marry him under any circumstances, but she still asked why Aslan was going so far. After all, he knows everything about her illness and that she doesn't have long to live. And this engagement initially had political goals, which have now become meaningless for both of them. So wouldn't it be better if Vivian spent the rest of her days alone? Aslan interrupted her and replied that she should not say that. He will not let her die and will save her no matter what it takes. At this moment, the butler called out to the prince and reminded him that he needed to finish state affairs. Aslan looked at Vivian again and said that they would return to the conversation about the wedding tomorrow, but for now she needed to get some good rest. He gently stroked the girl's hair, but the fear of what might happen did not leave Vivian. As he left the bedroom, the prince apologized for perhaps having pressed her too hard. Coming out into the corridor, the butler noticed that something was bothering the prince, and he could not ignore it. He approached Aslan and asked if everything was okay with him. After all, despite the wounds he received, he found the strength within himself and brought the girl to this house. And he worries about the prince no less than about Madame Vivian. Aslan replied that everything was fine, and asked to find out everything about the girl's family, including their personal life. He wanted to know why Vivian had been brought to such an irreversible stage of a fatal illness, and why this fact had been hidden from society. The butler replied that he would begin an investigation tomorrow and try to find out as much information as possible. Vivian reread the document again and didn't understand why there was such a rush. She had her own plans, and now the prince so unexpectedly insists on their wedding. Vivian wanted to get away from everyone and spend the rest of her life at the most magnificent and luxurious resort. And now the prince insists that she be nearby, and this ruins all her plans. At that moment, someone knocked on the bedroom door and asked permission to enter. Vivian felt awkward for a moment. No one called her madam. The maid looked into the bedroom and said that His Highness would like to give her something. She came in and added that the prince asked that Madame be sure to have breakfast with him tomorrow. Over breakfast, he would like to talk to her about the details of their marriage certificate. The next morning, several maids came into the bedroom again to prepare Madame for breakfast. Vivian could not understand why His Highness was so gentle and caring with her. He could have simply pretended, and that would have been enough. The girl remembered that during yesterday's conversation, the prince had promised to save her from death by any means necessary. And then Vivian remembered that the plot of the novel spoke of some kind of magical cure for tuberculosis. It was developed by a chemist and physician friend of Aslan's at the personal request of His Majesty. So will she be able to hold out until the cure is created? Then the maid said that everything was ready, and Vivian looked at herself in the mirror. The girls began to say in unison that this outfit suited Madame very well, and that her hair was simply magnificent. A few minutes later, Vivian, accompanied by her maids, was already heading to the dining room. She decided not to give in to Aslan's influence under any circumstances, and to understand what would be more beneficial for her. At first, everything went well. The prince had never mentioned the marriage certificate. After breakfast, the head chef came into the dining room and asked if Madame liked the prepared dishes. Vivian smiled sweetly and replied that she hadn't tasted such delicious food in a long time. The chef tactfully kissed Vivian's hand and said that he would continue to try not to disappoint Madame. But Aslan didn't seem to like it, and he said sharply that the meat was too burnt. Doesn't a chef know the ideal temperature for cooking meat dishes? The cook began to apologize, but Vivian did not understand the prince's anger because everything was prepared magnificently. Aslan stood up abruptly from the table and said that breakfast was over and it was time to get down to business. He approached Vivian and offered to continue yesterday's conversation. Aslan placed the marriage certificate in front of the girl and put an ink pen into her hand. Vivian began to resist and said that this was no longer a conversation, and the prince was forcing her to sign the document by force. Aslan squeezed the girl's hand and replied that he could not wait any longer. He pressed hard on the piece of paper and began to write Vivian's name. The girl screamed that the prince was hurting her and forcefully pulled her hand away. Vivian's strong jerk caught Aslan in the stomach with her elbow, and he cried out. She dropped the feather and asked if he was okay. The prince replied that compared to her illness, it was a mere trifle. Vivian asked why His Highness was going so far. Of course, she had previously been obsessed with the idea of marriage. But now she has no feelings for him, and all she wants is to spend the remaining year of her life peacefully. She was ready to take on all the problems associated with the dissolution of the engagement and convince the prince that she would not divulge the secret of his curse. Aslan came up to the table and said that in that case they would do something different. He turned the marriage certificate over and began to write something on the back. The prince finished writing and said that using all of Astaroth's information and financial resources, he promised to cure Vivian of her illness. And if after this year she remains alive, she will sign this marriage certificate. The girl took the document and couldn't make a decision right away. She didn't believe that her life would not end, because the disease was already too advanced. Aslan had many opportunities to get rid of her, but he tries to take care of her and protect her. And the fact that the prince is so persistently trying to persuade her, doesn't this mean that he can't just kill his bride? Maybe it's worth staying here and holding out until a cure for her is created. Still, Vivian didn't want to die, and she said she agreed. Aslan replied that he, in turn, would not insist on the engagement ahead of time and would fulfill his promise to save his bride. Thus, Vivian remained to live in the mansion of Prince Aslan Rejef and wait for the creation of a saving medicine. The girl understood that under no circumstances could she trust him 100%. Who knows what he really has in mind, and at some point he might change his mind and not fulfill his promise. Just in case, Vivian packed an emergency kit and was ready to escape at any moment. At that moment, Aslan entered the bedroom and caught Vivian by surprise. He looked around the room and said that it seemed like they had come to an agreement and come to a common decision. And now the bedroom looked like Vivian was about to run away. The scattered things and the suitcase in the middle of the room indicated all this. The girl had no choice but to play the role of a naive, stupid fool. Vivian looked at Aslan and tried to get out of this awkward and dangerous situation. She frantically began to collect the scattered outfits and items and said that she was simply looking for a suitable outfit. She just wanted to go out into the garden and get some fresh air, but she can't find a suitable dress. Due to her illness, she lost a lot of weight, and now all her outfits look ridiculous on her. Aslan grabbed his head and replied that she was worrying about such nonsense in vain. He added that Vivian always looks great to him and she looks beautiful in any outfit. The girl tried to understand whether such a stupid excuse worked and whether the prince believed her. Aslan urgently called the butler and ordered him to immediately cancel all his plans. He added that he and Vivian would immediately leave for the city and ordered a carriage to be prepared. Of course, the girl hadn't planned any walk, but now she would have to go to the city with the prince. Vivian tried to tell the prince that he shouldn't bother, that she could easily take a walk on her own, but Aslan replied that she was too ill to go out alone. The girl was upset. Everything didn't go according to plan again. But in order not to arouse the prince's suspicions, I had to remain silent and obey. Vivian didn't remember when she was just walking around the city lately. The thoughts in her head were working chaotically, and now she began to notice people and see city life. Even when she was at home, Vivian lived as if she were dead and could not fully relax and enjoy her freedom. After she was reincarnated and got into the affair, she was always getting into some kind of trouble. Aslan looked at the girl and warned her that there were a lot of people here and told her to be extremely careful. Vivian replied that he shouldn't worry, everything would be fine. Walking down the street, they found themselves in a busy market and were walking between the rows of shops. While shopping, Vivian approached one of the counters, noticed bright iridescent stones, and asked Aslan what kind of treasure they were. The prince replied that these were magic stones and he could buy her anything. The girl said that it was necessary to do this. Since she didn't have magical powers, she wouldn't be able to use them anyway. Aslan replied that they could buy them simply as souvenirs, but Vivian could not understand why the prince was so eager to spend money on her. The girl put the stone back on the counter and said that she didn't need anything. Magic stones were for those who wielded magic, for those like His Highness. And then she noticed a counter opposite with various weapons. Vivian took one of the swords and said that this one suited her better. The merchant exclaimed with delight that for a girl she handled a weapon too professionally. The girl caught the prince's surprised look and thought to herself, she is the daughter of the famous military family Eleanor and will not give up so easily. Aslan couldn't read Vivian's thoughts. He only saw that she was simply magnificent with a weapon in her hands. And then the girl heard some strange sound and looked around warily. One of the townspeople shouted that he had noticed a thief and was asking for help. Of course, Vivian could easily catch him, but now she needs to remain calm and carefully hide her identity from the prince. But the man continued to call for help and ask the thief to return the thing because it was his mother's heirloom. And then Vivian couldn't stand it any longer and ran to where the screams were coming from. She saw the poor girl asking for the stolen item to be returned to her and claimed that she had seen everything with her own eyes. The thief brazenly shouted that he didn't owe anyone anything, and the next second swung at her. At that moment, Vivian ran up and grabbed the thief's hand, thereby preventing the blow. The man suddenly pulled his hand away and asked who she was and where she came from. He clenched his fist and told her to get lost if she didn't want it right now. And then the thief felt someone tap him on the shoulder from behind and turned around. It was Aslan, and he asked who he dared to raise his vile little hand against. The thief realized that the forces were unequal and handed over the stolen item. The girl hugged the bag containing the family heirloom and began to thank the strangers for their help. She asked the stranger to state her name so that she would know to whom she was grateful for her salvation. At that moment, the city guard approached them and asked if everything was all right. Vivian didn't need this meeting with the guardians of order at all. She grabbed Aslan and dragged him out of the market square. The girl watched them go, hoping that they would meet again someday. And the girl ran between the shopping rows, tightly clutching the prince's hand. Suddenly, Vivian stopped abruptly, let go of the prince and began to apologize for grabbing Aslan without permission. The prince looked at the girl and said that she had just called him by name for the first time in a long time. Aslan himself took Vivian's hand and asked her not to call him Your Highness anymore. At first the girl was embarrassed, but then she replied that from now on she would call him by his name, Aslan. The prince, without letting go of Vivian's hand, approached her and looked intently into her eyes. Aslan said that since they had already bought her clothes, they could return to the mansion. And Vivian had already regretted 100 times that she had called the prince by his name, thereby giving him hope for her consent. Hans, holding the will in his hands, thought that his younger brother certainly had his quirks. But at least he won't be bored for a while. Vivian walked behind Aslan and thought that if the rest of the days were as peaceful, perhaps she would be able to hold out for a year. But she was wrong about everything being okay until that day came. At first, Vivian couldn't remember how she ended up in this place. And why is he sitting in the gazebo opposite the crown prince? The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember exactly when something went wrong. That morning, she asked Aslan to let her go to the bank alone. The prince agreed and replied that he would give her his best guard. But somehow Vivian managed to persuade Aslan, and she got into the carriage and went to the city alone. After some time, the area seemed unfamiliar to her, and the girl asked the coachman if this road led to the bank. But he, remaining calm, replied that they were taking a shortcut. Finally, the coachman said that they had arrived and opened the carriage door. But it wasn't a bank. Vivian was standing in front of some mansion she didn't recognize. Now the girl understood that she had been kidnapped, but she remained calm, accepting this turn of fate. The crown prince politely said that her coachman had accidentally taken a wrong turn, and since that was the case, he suggested that the girl take a little rest. The girl understood that the crown prince was lying, but that was exactly how the plot of the original novel unfolded. She remembered that Prince Aslan Astaroth and Crown Prince Hans Astaroth were sworn enemies. Unlike Hans, Aslan Astaroth was the son of a concubine servant, making his older brother the prime candidate to inherit the throne. Hans knew that Aslan had been cursed by Astaroth, but this curse was a time bomb that could be activated at any moment. The crown prince considered this a dangerous problem for the imperial family, and that is why he tried to control Aslan. Vivian was wary. Her presence here was probably connected with Aslan. The girl's thoughts were interrupted by Hans's voice, who calmly asked if she liked the beautiful view of the sea. He added that it is because of this view that he often comes to this mansion, and it lifts his spirits. And now, thanks to Vivian's arrival, he likes this place even more. The girl lied that she was not feeling well, and that it was better for her to leave his mansion. The crown prince replied that the imperial family was aware of her illness, and everyone was very worried about her health, which is why she was here, and Hans would like to recommend a good court physician to her. Vivian didn't believe his words. It seemed like the prince was testing her. Hans continued by saying that he was surprised at his younger brother's carelessness if he never showed the lady to a good doctor. The prince's words sounded like he was trying to drive a wedge between her and Aslan. The girl replied that she understood her fiancé. He simply did not want to abuse his power for personal gain. And if the crown prince had no more topics for conversation, she would like to leave. At that moment, a cat came up to Vivian and began to cuddle with the hem of her dress. Hans said that he had heard somewhere that she had a talent for taming animals. The beast doesn't listen to him. Maybe Vivian can help with this. The girl replied that, on the contrary, she seemed very kind and calm. And then the crown prince said that this was not the cat we were talking about. Suddenly Vivian heard some footsteps behind her. It was Aslan, and he said that Hans had no right to just take his bride and bring her to him. The crown prince stood up from the table and replied that his brother must protect Vivian. It would be unpleasant if some dangerous beast targeted her. With these words, Hans smiled slyly and looked at his brother. Aslan looked back and said that he was a little sorry, but this tea party was over. And Hans brazenly approached Vivian and said that he would wait for her visit again in his mansion. The girl was shocked. The crown prince's behavior looked as if she had come here on purpose. Vivian began to cough violently out of excitement and covered her mouth with her hand. Aslan told Hans that if something happened to her because of him, he would not let it go. The crown prince stroked the cat and replied that it seemed Vivian was already delighted with another animal. And then he added that his brother was not looking for love, but only hunting for her fortune, and when she faced the truth, he would look at her face. He will be looking forward to this moment. The doctor said that due to a recent incident, Madame's health had deteriorated significantly. Aslan replied that he felt guilty and would never let Vivian go alone again. He knew that his brother had come south for a short time, but he could not imagine that he would hunt for his bride. If his brother tries to sow discord between him and Vivian, he will be very angry. At that moment, for the sake of his bride, Aslan was ready to kill Hans and everyone who stood in their way. And at the same time, it seemed to him that he understood his brother completely. But now Vivian believes him and his words. Unlike the day he said that this villainess would never become his wife. Aslan returned to Vivian and decided to ask directly how unpleasant he was to her. But at that very second, he realized that he was not ready to hear an answer that was unpleasant to him and asked to forget about his question. And yet the girl replied that she did not feel any hostility towards the prince. Vivian wanted to add something, but at that moment she was overcome by a strong cough again. The doctor immediately said that now the lady needed absolute rest and suggested that everyone leave her bedroom. The prince walked down the corridor of the mansion, and Vivian's last words did not leave his head. But he was afraid of the moment when the girl would have to face his true nature. Who knows how her opinion of him will change after this? Will this feeling of hostility remain if Vivian encounters a dangerous beast? Aslan was afraid of her death. He did not want to let her go. to lock her up and hide her from everyone, so that Vivian would always be reflected only in his eyes. The girl reflected on the fact that everything that was supposed to happen to the main character was now happening to her. And if this is not a coincidence, then, according to the novel, something should have happened next. A few days later, the prince was informed of the arrival of an envoy from the imperial palace. The letter stated that Aslan Rajef Astaroth and Vivian Eleanor were not receiving permission to marry. The prince informed his bride that he was ordered to return to the capital immediately. Aslan was angry, and Vivian tried her best to calm the prince. The girl realized that the next event, as in the novel, would definitely take place in the capital. But it would be better for her to stay in the mansion and not steal events from the main character. It was difficult, and something needed to be done urgently. But at the moment, nothing depended on Vivian, so she had to obey and go to the capital with Aslan. After all, no one has the right to resist the imperial decree. The prince said that before going to the imperial palace they would stop in Blackford. Vivian remained silent. She was ready for anything. In any case, she couldn't change anything now. When she entered, the girl was shocked. She had never seen such a huge hall. The country house seemed very cozy to her, but she was not prepared for the fact that it would be even more luxurious. The prince replied that she would have to get used to it and pointed to the girl's room. The room was magnificent, but Vivian found it to be a walk-through room. She asked if her bedroom shouldn't be separated from the other rooms. Aslan replied that according to the rules, the bedrooms of the Duke and Duchess must be connected. Vivian asked if this meant that the prince would be constantly watching her. Aslan replied that these were the rules and she would have to endure it. Besides, he doesn't want to take his eyes off Vivian for a moment. Therefore, in honor of her arrival here, he would like to arrange a special banquet. After these words, Aslan took Vivian's hand and squeezed it tightly. At that moment, the girl's imagination did not run wild. Vivian instinctively pulled her hand back and thought that it was scary to even imagine such a thing as a joke. In response to the prince's questioning look, the girl said that her hand was a little sweaty. Aslan took Vivian's hand again, but she could not understand why fate had given her all these events. After a hearty dinner, the prince and Vivian went out into the night garden together to get some fresh air before bed. But the only thing she wanted now was to be alone. Besides, this walk seemed to her like some kind of unpleasant compulsion. Aslan asked Vivian what her general impression of Blackford was. The girl replied that the mansion was simply luxurious, and the servants were very kind to her. She remembered very well that in her home all the servants seemed to avoid her, and Vivian knew that it was all because of her illness. They thought she was contagious. But here she likes their attention, and she is completely fine. Aslan turned to the girl and said that no interference from the imperial palace would prevent him from protecting her as his bride. The prince's bold statement scared Vivian a little. Was he really so responsible about their marriage contract? Maybe he is pretending and saying this on purpose in the presence of the servants. However, she was well aware of how many reproaches were leveled at Aslan when she wrote her will and disappeared. He is probably in a difficult situation, although he tries not to show it. Lost in her thoughts, Vivian heard only the prince's last words about not paying attention to what they said in the palace. She replied that in any case there was no need to strain myself for her sake. To which Aslan said that even if the palace was against their wedding, he would find another way. The prince was a little hurt by Vivian's words that he shouldn't bother for her sake. Did his feelings for her seem insincere to Vivian? But considering how much pain he caused her, it seems too early to win her back. Vivian lay in her bedroom bed and couldn't sleep. She felt that Aslan was right behind this curtain, where there was not even a wall or a door. Vivian remembered the prince's promise that he would not disturb her and closed her eyes. The audience procedure was supposed to take place in a few days, and the girl hoped that nothing would happen. Vivian was almost asleep when she suddenly heard strange sounds behind the curtain. The girl called out to Aslan, but there was no answer, and this made her wary. She quietly approached the curtain, carefully pulled it aside, and asked permission to enter. But what she saw the next moment made her scream in horror. The prince groaned and scratched his chest, writhing as if in convulsions. Vivian ran into Aslan's bedroom, helped him sit up, and asked if everything was okay. Is the influence of the capital really to blame for everything? Vivian had heard somewhere that the capital was a sacred place where, in the distant past, a hero defeated the demon Astaroth. So does the demon living in Aslan's body really have a negative influence on him? Vivian said she would call the court physician immediately. But at that moment, the prince grabbed the girl's hand tightly. He asked Vivian to just be there and complained of dizziness. Of course, the girl could not leave Aslan alone in such a state. Vivian said she would be there, but she couldn't do anything. Gradually, the prince calmed down, and Vivian wondered what the main character would do in her place. And then the girl remembered that she had sung him a lullaby. Of course, she doesn't sing that well, but she can't just leave the prince like that either. Suddenly, Vivian remembered how Aslan, in the guise of a black lion, wounded, saved her life, and quietly sang a lullaby. She sang so quietly as not to wake the imperial palace, so that only the prince could hear her. In the morning, Vivian felt something was disturbing her sleep. It was the bright morning sun that was shining right in her face. The girl turned away and muttered that she wanted to sleep a little longer. And suddenly, through her sleep, she heard Aslan's voice, who quietly said that it was still early and she could sleep. Vivian jumped up abruptly and realized that she was in the same bed with the prince. Looking in bewilderment at Aslan's half-naked body, the girl tried to remember how she ended up in his bedroom. Oh yes, she sang a lullaby to the prince yesterday and apparently fell asleep herself. And Aslan lay down next to her and gently hugged her shoulders. Vivian asked in a frightened voice, because they definitely didn't have anything yesterday. And the prince just looked at the girl and smiled. Then the butler knocked on the bedroom door, and Vivian was surprised when the prince allowed him to enter. The butler opened the door and, seeing the prince in the company of Vivian, began to apologize sheepishly. Aslan said that everything was fine and asked what happened. The butler reported that 2 envoys had arrived from Eleanor's family, and they were to take Madame to the duchy. Aslan was perplexed. Someone came to his house without an invitation and even wanted to take his bride. The butler replied that Madame needed to return as her stepsister had recently arrived. And only now did Vivian realize that they were talking about the main character named Iris. The prince got out of bed and, putting on his shirt, was about to leave the room. But then Vivian told Aslan that she would also like to meet her sister, since she was in the capital. The prince was surprised because the girl's sister was only a stepsister. Vivian insisted she wanted to know how she was doing, and besides, she had left the house causing a big commotion. The girl looked into the prince's eyes and imploringly said that it would be better if they went together. She added that if her father found out how strong their relationship was, he wouldn't scold her too much. Aslan could not resist Vivian's request and agreed. After breakfast, a carriage was immediately brought in and headed straight to meet the arriving guests. Vivian apologized again for having to travel together to meet her sister. The prince replied that everything was fine and he wanted to personally see what the atmosphere was like in the duchy. The girl fell silent, thinking that everything was going according to her plan so far. And if nothing happens, the prince and the main character will finally meet. Until a cure for tuberculosis appeared, it was necessary to distract Aslan's attention and switch it to someone else. And that distraction must certainly be her half-sister Iris. Besides, she had a very kind soul, and she sympathized with her villainous sister until the very end. In Vivian's head, pieces appeared like chess pieces, each playing its own important role. She imagined the angry prince threatening Vivian for knowing about his terrible curse. But then Sister Iris intervened and began to defend Vivian, saying that it was she who introduced them to the prince and would not tell anyone about this secret. The prince seemed to think about Iris's words and was in no hurry to destroy Vivian. And then he gave her medicine for tuberculosis and told her to get as far away as possible. Yes, this outcome of events would be the most ideal. The prince noticed that Vivian was smiling and asked what she was thinking about. The bright morning sun illuminated the windows of the Eleanor Duchy with its warm rays. The father looked at Iris with concern and asked why she was eating almost nothing and if everything was okay. The girl replied that she was tormented by thoughts about whether she dared to be here at all. The Duke replied that these were empty worries, because he was her father and was very glad of her arrival. Iris said that she was also glad to meet them, but she was an illegitimate daughter and could become a burden to him. The Duke, without stopping his breakfast, replied that yes, indeed, her mother was an ordinary servant. But he truly loved her and still regrets that he could not be with her according to the laws of the duchy. So he would like to give Iris what he could not give to her mother. The girl was grateful to her father for his care, but she still felt some anxiety. But when her savior returned the family heirloom to her, Iris felt relief and joy. The girl really wanted to know how she was doing and whether they would be able to meet again. But when she heard the news from her father that her sister Vivian was arriving today, Iris immediately threw those thoughts out of her head. Without even finishing her breakfast, the girl jumped up from the table she needed to get ready for the meeting with her stepsister as quickly as possible. But her father immediately stopped her and reminded her that Vivian was very cunning, just like her late mother, and no one knows what harm she can do to Iris, so she should be careful. The daughter replied that she didn't want to think badly of Vivian until she saw her for herself. The Duke said that Iris was too kind, and he would be glad that his daughter would have the opportunity to meet the prince himself. The girl looked at her father in surprise, and he added that this was exactly what he wanted to talk about. He said that Aslan Rajef Astaroth was the second prince of the imperial palace, and he, as a father, would try to ensure that Iris took a place next to him. The daughter looked at her father in surprise, because Aslan was the fiancé of her half-sister Vivian. At that moment, they were informed that Madame and the second prince of the imperial palace had arrived in the duchy. Although the Duke had plans for Aslan, he could not have imagined that he would arrive here with his daughter Vivian. But the next second he thought that perhaps his visit here was even for the best. He smiled at Iris and said that the engagement would go much faster now. As soon as Vivian and Aslan entered the main hall, they immediately noticed from the behavior of the servants that they were expected there. The girl did not expect such a warm welcome after her escape. She immediately asked one of the servants where her sister was, and they were told that Lady Iris was having breakfast in the living room with the Duke, so they asked them to wait a little. Aslan thought it was impudent to force a sick girl to come here and then keep her waiting. The prince ordered that it be reported immediately that Madame Vivian was very tired from the journey and could not wait until the Duke finished his breakfast. At that moment, Iris came down the stairs and cried out with joy when she saw her savior in front of her. She ran up to Vivian and asked if she didn't remember that unpleasant incident at the market. Then the Duke approached them, greeted His Highness, and introduced them to his daughter Iris Eleanor. Vivian was surprised that the girl from the market square was her half-sister, but right now it was more important that she looked at the prince and not at her. The Duke recalled the refusal he had sent, and added that it was he who had initiated the dissolution of the engagement between Vivian and Aslan. The prince managed to restrain himself only thanks to his acquired manners and upbringing. Vivian looked at her father and realized that the break in the engagement was indeed true. But that was exactly what she had planned. Now she needed to bring Aslan and Iris together so that everything would go according to her plan. The main thing is that their marriage agreement with the princes does not break before a saving medicine is created. Vivian looked at Aslan, and it was not difficult to see that he was completely furious. She took the prince by the arm and asked him to calm down and not to get nervous ahead of time. The Duke sharply told Vivian not to cling to His Highness anymore. It was all useless now. To somehow relieve the tension, Iris suggested that everyone go to a more convenient place for conversation. With difficulty restraining himself, Aslan said that the Duke's decision to break off the engagement seemed ridiculous to him. Vivian tried to calm the prince again, but at that moment her father approached Iris. He wanted to grab his daughter by the hand and said menacingly, could she really disobey the will of her father? Iris shouted that it was true, she would not obey his order. The Duke swung sharply at his daughter and called her a useless piece of trash. But at that moment Vivian stood between him and Iris and received a strong blow to the face. The Duke said menacingly that nothing would stop him from discussing with His Majesty the dissolution of their engagement. Trying to remain calm, Vivian said that she was not feeling well and would stay here today. Her father looked after her with hatred and called her decision unheard of impudence. Vivian could have easily simply stopped her father's hand instead of receiving a slap, but she deliberately staged this dramatic scene to win Iris's favor, and everything turned out much better than she expected. The stepsister caught up with Vivian and asked if she was okay, since it was her fault that she got it. Now Aslan did not interfere in the family scandal of Eleanor's family, but he knew for sure that he would not leave it alone. Stopping near one of the doors, Vivian told Aslan that this was her room. The prince gently stroked the girl's reddened cheek and said that she would still become his wife. He added that Vivian now needed to rest and asked her to promise not to get into any more arguments with her father, so as not to make the situation worse. Aslan said that she didn't need to be nervous, at least for the sake of the one who loved her so much. And he, for his part, will always try to protect her from any troubles. At some point, Vivian felt like she heard those words, only it was a long time ago. Aslan left the girl to rest and added that he needed to take care of some business. The girl looked after him after all. Aslan was the most mysterious man of all she knew. The prince left the room and walked decisively towards the living room. The Duke, seeing His Highness, tried to apologize for this unpleasant moment with Vivian, but Aslan interrupted him. He said that he had other business with the Duke. Aslan would like to know more about the engagement proposal between him and Iris Eleanor. The Duke was happy to discuss the matter and ordered the maid to take His Highness to his study. But the prince refused and said that it would be better if they talked in the fresh air. Vivian took a book from the shelf and decided to read a little before bed. She felt something pressing unpleasantly on her side and saw another book under the pillow. Opening the bookmarked page, Vivian read that news of a death had arrived from her maternal relatives. My great-aunt retired and died suddenly in an accident. Her estate passed on to 2 small children, a brother and sister. Vivian recognized the handwriting and realized that it was her personal diary, which she had kept as a child, and which was still lying under her pillow. The girl scrolled down to the last entry, which ended just when she developed tuberculosis. Suddenly, someone knocked on the window and Vivian jumped in surprise. She decided it was just the wind and got up to close the window. Vivian abruptly pulled back the curtain and the next moment saw a black silhouette in front of her. The girl asked with fear who he was, and then she recognized the young man. It was her brother Alex. He smiled and said that he had come to visit his sister. Vivian asked why he had climbed through the window and scared her so much. Alex replied that he had no choice if he had entered through the main entrance. The servants would have immediately dragged him to his father. The girl understood that if her brother did this, then there was a very good reason for it. The brother leaned toward Vivian and asked if she had anything she wanted to tell him. Alex asked to tell the truth. Why didn't his sister tell him that she had tuberculosis? He only learned from others that she even wrote a suicide note and ran away. Vivian couldn't tell her brother that she had experienced rebirth. At that moment, she was not herself, and she had no time for Alex. The brother said that Vivian knew very well that he went to study abroad to gain strength and protect her from her father. And now his sister is sick, and despite the upcoming graduation, he must be there. Vivian said she was fine and that her brother had to go back to the academy and couldn't just up and leave during the semester. The sister apologized for making Alex worry, but as far as he could see, she looked quite healthy. And only now did the young man notice the redness on Vivian's cheek. Alex couldn't believe that his father did this right in front of His Majesty's eyes. But even after this act, he considered his father a real coward. Alex asked why Vivian had deliberately put herself in harm's way. It seemed like it was more than just a matter of breaking off the engagement. The girl said that she didn't do it just like that. There was a reason for it. She added that Aslan was not going to give up easily and would seek the Duke's consent. Of course, the brother had information that the prince did not treat Vivian very well. But it was the Empress who wanted to keep Aslan in order to make Hans emperor. That's why she slipped Vivian to him as a bride, and now she's unlikely to agree to break off this engagement. The brother leaned towards his sister and said that if anyone tried to hurt her, he should know about it. Even if the offender is the Duke himself, Alex will not let it go. Vivian found her brother's determination amusing and laughed out loud. Having calmed down from laughter, the girl asked if Alex would stay in the duchy for the night. The brother replied that it was unlikely, he had only come to see Vivian. But it looks like he still has a serious conversation to have with his father. The girl advised Alex to be calm and not do anything stupid. Leaving the room, they asked a passing maid where their father was, and she replied that he was out for a walk with His Majesty. Vivian began to worry. What could be so urgent that matters needed to be resolved at night? Yes, Aslan had said before leaving that he still had some things to sort out, and now it was worrying her. This means he wanted to discuss some issues specifically with her father. At the end of the conversation, the Duke asked the prince to take care of his daughter Iris. Aslan asked what he was going to do with Vivian now. The Duke replied that there was no need to worry about her, she would marry Sir Nicholas. The prince was surprised, because the Margrave of the Borderlands was already well over 50. The Duke replied that it was a good match. Sir Nicholas had recently been widowed, and this worried the Emperor. So Vivian will not waste the rest of her life, and will certainly be flattered by this opportunity. The prince knew very well about this man and what happened to the women who married him. The Duke looked at His Majesty and said that he hoped that they understood each other, because soon they would become relatives after all. But then Aslan said that he would now reveal one very important secret to the Duke. The next second he suddenly grabbed the Duke right by the throat. The prince said that he was lucky. Few people could see him from this side. The Duke felt real horror when the eyes of a real demon looked at him. The prince finally received a full report on Eleanor's family. The previous Duke had only one daughter, but her poor health made it difficult to entrust her with duties. But the Duke valued her talent in politics and needed someone to take his place, but the actual power would have to pass to his daughter. And then he accepted into the family an ordinary son-in-law from a side branch who was the current Duke Eleanor. But the poisoning of the Duchess was only the beginning. Vivian was to be the next victim. The girl experienced constant violence from the current Duke. Everything was arranged so that she would experience the negative impact of public opinion. And now they were also planning to break off Vivian's engagement. Aslan raised his stick and said that he was giving the Duke one last chance to make things right. He ordered to go immediately to the Emperor and beg him to cancel the dissolution of the engagement. Otherwise, the horror he just saw could become a nightmarish reality for him. The prince released the Duke and reminded him that this was his last and only chance. The frightened Duke understood that before him was a real demon who would do anything to achieve his goal. But he plucked up his courage and asked what benefit His Majesty had from some Vivian and why he cared so much about her. Aslan replied that the Duke would never understand this with his weak mind. This girl has penetrated his mind and heart, and everything belongs only to her. Vivian woke up, but she didn't want to open her eyes, much less get up. Then she felt with her hand that her bed was somehow warm and soft. The girl opened her eyes and saw Aslan sleeping peacefully next to her. When the prince opened his eyes, Vivian said she hadn't even heard him enter. She asked where he went at night, but Aslan only silently pressed the girl to his chest. It seemed to her that she had already experienced this feeling of calm and bliss. Vivian asked if his activities yesterday had anything to do with his father. The prince did not answer and pretended to fall asleep again. At that moment, Alex burst into the bedroom and exclaimed in a cheerful voice that he had brought morning medicine for his little sister. Vivian turned around sharply and opened her mouth in surprise. But Alex did not expect to see his beloved sister in the company of His Highness, and even in the same bed with him. After a few minutes of general confusion, the prince and Alex shook hands, Alex apologizing for the awkward intrusion. Now Aslan knew that Vivian had a brother. But he didn't like the fact that he had disappeared somewhere, and was now pretending to be a decent, loving relative. Alex also had his own opinion about the prince. At first he ignored his younger sister, but now he pretends to be a caring protector. Aslan said that they would stay here for a few days, so Alex would have time to talk to his little sister. Vivian added that besides, she hadn't even had a chance to really talk to her half-sister Iris. The prince said that the only person they would not be able to meet was the Duke, who had gone to the imperial palace. Vivian wondered if Aslan had done something bad to disrupt her plans. Since the prince set out to find his bride, he has learned to maintain a cool, calm demeanor even in the most difficult situations. Moreover, he now easily controls his mind even in a cursed state. It was Vivian who was the impetus that influenced Aslan's willpower. Alex, hearing about his father's trip, was surprised that he really began to oppose the engagement of Vivian and His Majesty. But, remembering the upcoming breakfast, he cast aside all speculation and suspicion and invited everyone to the table. Vivian partly understood why the prince had decided to stay here for a few days. It was because her health had deteriorated again. This means we can relax for a while and at least have breakfast. Still, Vivian was bothered by the fact that in the original, the main character went to the imperial palace. It was there that she faced terrible humiliation at the hands of the Empress. In a situation where the main character's events are constantly happening to her, she needs to remember more details from the novel in order to somehow cope with it. At the end of breakfast, the prince called his servant and asked him to bring something. The servant headed for the exit, and Aslan smiled mysteriously, picking at his plate. As Vivian stepped out into the hallway, she began coughing again, and Alex suggested that she go to his bedroom and rest. The sister replied that the bedroom was too stuffy, and that she would feel much better in the fresh air. The prince told Alex that he had mentioned that he had once been involved in fencing, and, without waiting for the young man's answer, he suggested arranging a duel to see his skills. The prince looked at Vivian and said that he dedicated this duel to his bride. Something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what. Once out in the garden, Vivian and Iris settled comfortably in the gazebos and prepared to cheer for the young man. Aslan and Alex crossed their swords and began to fight. Vivian always felt a sense of delight when she heard the clang of iron weapons. All negative thoughts immediately disappeared somewhere, and the girl only regretted that she herself could not take part in the duel. Alex put up a defense and exclaimed that he was the best graduate of the academy, and as the future heir, he is simply obliged to uphold the brand of the duchy. Iris said with annoyance that she too would like to learn the art of fencing, but she only sits in her room and reads books. And then Vivian replied that if her sister learned magic, she would also be able to fight. Suddenly, she remembered a very important plot detail from the original novel. The place where the main character met the Empress and was humiliated. The place where the Empress was nearly crushed to death by a wardrobe that fell due to poor construction. It was there that the Empress blamed everything on the main character, who happened to be in that place. Vivian jumped up and exclaimed that this was the Imperial Library. The question then is, if she doesn't go to the library, can she avoid tragedy? After all, it is possible that fate follows not the place, but the heroine herself. Due to intense excitement, Vivian began to suffer from a severe cough again. The prince heard this, saw blood on the ground again, and immediately threw down his sword. The girl dimly saw Aslan and Alex running towards her, and everything swam before her eyes. The prince stood for some time in front of Vivian's closed bedroom door. The doctor was saying something unintelligible, and his words did not inspire confidence at all. Aslan added that it seemed the local doctor had never properly examined Vivian, and it was unlikely that treatment would be effective under such conditions. Here Alex sighed and quietly said that it was his fault. He went to study abroad for Vivian's sake, but apparently this action only caused her more pain and problems. Aslan didn't answer. He was thinking that she was always so stupid in caring about others. Perhaps it was this very trait of hers that he initially fell in love with. The prince did not want to see his Vivian suffer anymore. Let her wake up soon. The girl felt unbearable pain in her chest due to a strong cough. Once she was ready for death, but now she clings so desperately to life. The girl sat up on the bed and asked to tell the prince to believe in her. Vivian's words were immediately conveyed to his majesty. Aslan understood that she said this only to calm his worries. But in his eyes, Vivian was the strongest and most honest girl on earth. The next morning, Aslan was already sitting in her bedroom. It seemed that yesterday's illness had receded a little. A few minutes later, Iris and Alex looked into the room. But the prince closed the door in front of him and said that he must remain alone with his bride. When they were alone, the prince said that a pleasant surprise awaited her. Aslan asked Vivian to close her eyes. And then Aslan allowed me to open my eyes. The girl looked and could not believe what she saw in front of her. This expensive necklace with many precious stones was simply magnificent and sparkled in the sun. Vivian wondered why such an expensive gift was given, and without any special reason. She thanked the prince. She had to continue pretending until she received the coveted medicine. The prince didn't seem to like Vivian's dry answer and said that he was always testing her, and it's already becoming difficult for him to bear it. The girl got scared and realized that she needed to somehow save the situation. Vivian said she was grateful to him not only for the necklace he gave her, but also for bringing her here and helping her meet her family. It seemed to work. The prince walked up to the girl and gently kissed her on the forehead. Left alone, Vivian thought that the real villain from the novel probably also dreamed of being happy. Perhaps if she were in her place, she could give her such a good ending. With these thoughts, she threw the diary into the fireplace, and it immediately burst into a bright flame. Then Alex came in, and they stood silently near the fireplace and looked at the burning flames. He turned to his sister and suddenly suggested that she run away with him. The sister asked what would happen to Eleanor's estate, but the brother replied that Vivian's life was more important to him. The girl looked at Alex but replied that she would stay here. After all, His Majesty promised that he would cure her illness, so her brother should not worry about her. Besides, someone has to protect the inherited property. When Vivian felt much better, she and Aslan went to the imperial palace. The girl said that she was worried about her father's behavior. Who knows what else he might do against them? But the prince replied with confidence that this would definitely not happen again. Aslan said that he had news for Vivian, which he learned from his father. When she heard that they wanted to marry her to Sir Nicholas, she was terribly upset. But the prince reassured her, saying that Nicholas would soon lose his position and the marriage would be annulled. Vivian asked how this could happen to a distinguished state figure. The girl was a little confused, but she really wanted to believe the prince that everything would be fine. Finally, the carriage stopped, and Aslan was the first to get out of it. He extended his hand to Vivian and helped her out. The girl hoped that the prince would believe her even after she saved the life of the empress, whom Aslan hated so much. At first, everything went well, but it was necessary to try to find out whether Aslan was telling the truth. Vivian learned that the marriage had indeed been annulled. Nicholas had been accused of treason and might be executed. But the girl continued to think about breaking off her engagement to Aslan. Her thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the emperor, who asked to leave him and the prince alone. Vivian's facial expression and intonation did not seem very kind. She remembered that in the original novel, Aslan was constantly abused by his father. The girl was worried about the prince and did not want to leave him alone. As she walked out, she turned around and met the prince's eyes, his gaze saying that everything would be fine. Vivian tried to pull herself together. Now was not the time to worry about others. Ahead was the false accusation against her regarding the empress. Perhaps she will be able to change everything and save Her Majesty before it is too late. The emperor struck his son hard on the cheek and shouted at him for daring to deprive Sir Nicholas of his position by accusing him of treason. Aslan steadfastly endured the slap and asked if his father wasn't worried about him brazenly increasing his influence. Even if he had spoken out against Nicholas openly, his resignation would have taken place anyway. The emperor gritted his teeth and said that it seemed he had given his son too much freedom. In a commanding voice, he ordered Aslan to kneel, and the prince noticed a whip in his hand. The next second, the emperor swung, and his son steadfastly withstood the first blow, and drops of blood appeared on the expensive carpet. Aslan bowed his head and said that he thanked his majesty for his mercy. The enraged emperor hit his son again and shouted that this was not all. He asked how Aslan was going to justify himself regarding Duke Eleanor. He suddenly appeared before the emperor in fear and began to beg him to cancel the dissolution of the engagement of his daughter Vivian and the prince. The emperor put pressure on the duke, and he was forced to admit that he was being blackmailed by the demon Astaroth. The father looked at his son and asked if he had abused the power of the curse. The emperor leaned sharply towards Aslan and asked why he was so obsessed with this engagement. The prince, without thinking, wanted to answer that he loved Vivian, but his father would hardly believe it. And then the prince decided to say that he noticed true potential in her. The emperor asked incredulously what potential a tuberculosis patient could have, and then he heard that she had the power to suppress the curse of the demon Astaroth. Perhaps she will be the key that can break this vicious circle of curse. And in order to completely subordinate Vivian to the imperial palace, it is necessary to weaken the influence of her family. The father asked in surprise why he found out about this just when the girl was on the verge of death. Aslan shouted sharply that Vivian would not die. He will save his bride no matter what it costs him. Aslan put his hand to his chest and asked his father to reverse the decision to break off the engagement. Meanwhile, Vivian found the right door leading to the library. Now it was necessary to wait and stage a chance meeting. In the original novel, the bookshelf in the magic section was supposed to collapse, so we need to try to lure the Empress out to avoid tragedy. Vivian's head was aching from so many thoughts, and the novel said nothing about solving this problem. The girl began to walk nervously in front of the library and think that perhaps she needed to pretend to be ill in order to avoid going to the imperial palace. And suddenly she heard leisurely steps behind her. It was the Empress. Vivian turned sharply and bowed in reverence to Her Majesty. The Empress regretted that Hans had shown such a late interest in her. The girl looked very ill. Vivian said that if Her Majesty decided to visit the library, she should be very careful. The Empress looked questioningly at the girl. She did not understand the meaning of her words at all. Of course, Vivian couldn't say that it was written that way in the original novel. She knew it was all due to a mistake made during construction, but no one would believe her now. And then the girl said that she had heard that in the sections with magic books, accidents sometimes happen due to residual magic. The servant standing next to the Empress smiled and said that no accidents had ever occurred in the Imperial Library. Or Madam is hinting that someone has secretly set up a hidden trap there. The Empress coldly replied that this was all nonsense and not worth worrying about her health. Her Majesty proceeded into the library, and Vivian hurried after her and stood quietly behind the shelves. She stared at the cabinet that was closest to the Empress, but it did not seem fragile or unstable to her. Suddenly, she was startled by a maid who approached the shelf from her side. The girl noticed a small note in her hands and asked what book she was looking for. The maid replied that Her Majesty had asked her to find a magic book, but she was not very good at these titles, and then Vivian suggested that they look for it together. She was lucky and found what she needed on one of the shelves and extended her hand. Suddenly, the next moment, Vivian felt as if she had received a strong electric charge. She looked at her palm and saw a strange powder. The girl assumed that this was the residual magical energy from the books. Then the maid came up and Vivian gave her the book she had found. The maid thanked Madame and headed towards the Empress, and Vivian looked at her palm again. She felt as if she had already experienced something similar to the tingling sensation she had just experienced, and the girl remembered that the same thing had happened to her near the shop with magic stones in the market square. Then she took one of the stones that she liked, but immediately threw it away and asked Aslan what it was. The prince took her hand and explained that it was an explosive magic stone that exploded when magic was poured into it. It is so powerful that even a person who does not possess magic will feel its power. Vivian smiled sweetly at the merchant and said that customers should be warned about this. The girl remembered the magic dust on her palms and did not understand who could have brought a magic stone to the library, and most importantly, why. She saw the maid handing the book to the Empress, and she asked where she found it. The girl pointed to the shelves and said that Lady Vivian Eleanor had helped her find the book. The Empress looked at Vivian and then ordered the maid to take her to those shelves. At that moment, Vivian was very afraid that an irreversible tragedy was about to happen. She tried to block Her Majesty's way and shouted that she was not allowed there. And then the Empress saw some bright light on the top shelves of the rack. There was a blue magic stone lying on the shelf between the books, and it was from it that this glow came. The shelf wobbled and Vivian ran as fast as she could towards the Empress to save her from danger. She managed to knock Her Majesty to the floor, thereby saving her from the huge pile of books falling on them. A few minutes later, both came to their senses and saw a heavy bookshelf lying very close. The servants, seeing the horror that had happened, rushed screaming towards Her Majesty and the lady. Vivian helped the Empress sit up and asked if she was okay. Her Majesty grabbed her head, not understanding what had happened, and asked to call the court physician. And then the librarian said that he noticed some kind of light coming from the skirt of the maid who brought the book. The girl said that perhaps she just got dirty with something. But everyone started insisting on showing their pockets until no one left the library. She had no choice but to put her hand in her apron pocket and take out a couple of magic stones. Vivian recognized them. They were magical explosive stones. Now Vivian understood for sure that this was not an accident that could have ended in tragedy. It seems that the other people present did not think that the sudden fall of the shelf was an accident. The librarian ordered the maid to be seized immediately, but the poor girl tried to say that she was not guilty of anything. Vivian looked closely at the Empress to see if she would believe the maid. But the main thing was that now no one would falsely accuse Vivian of what happened. But on the other hand, if the maid was guilty, then why didn't she run away from the library right away? The Empress did not start a showdown and ordered the servant to be taken to the torture chamber. Here, Vivian said that before Her Majesty did so, she would like to add something. To handle such a powerful explosive stone so skillfully requires highly honed magical skills. The accused servant didn't know the magical language at all. She couldn't even find the necessary book on her own. And Vivian told about their conversation with the maid near the bookshelves. The note contained the title of the required book, which the maid could hardly read on her own. Therefore, it is unlikely that she could skillfully handle such a magical stone. Here, the librarian objected. The maid could have simply pretended that she did not know the magical language. In any case, this stone was found in her pocket. Another maid added that it was strange that the girl did not run away from the library after what happened, but was the first to run up to Her Majesty, and even with such evidence in her pocket. Vivian looked at the librarian. Perhaps he was the culprit. He was very persistent in trying to blame the poor girl. After all, to manage such a large library, and especially magical books, you need to be very well versed in magic. And this librarian is the one who fits the bill like no one else. He is the only one who knows this place like the back of his hand. But you can't just accuse a person, you need evidence. Vivian said that it was worth paying attention to the fragments of the magic stone that brought down the cabinet. If we can find out the source of the magic that remains here, we can find the criminal who wanted to harm Her Majesty. Vivian walked up to the maid, took her hand and said that if someone other than its owner touched the stone, a rejection reaction would occur. She placed the fragments of the stone on the girl's palm, and everyone saw the reaction, which meant the stone did not belong to the maid. Vivian glanced at the librarian and added that if the fragments fell into the hands of the owner, there would be no such reaction. The servant replied that the stone had already been used, so its magic would evaporate in a few minutes. Vivian came closer to him and replied that she still had time to check. She added that she did not want to suspect anyone in particular, and immediately took the librarian's hand. And the next moment, the fragments of the magic stone lay in his palm. And then everyone saw that they were not responding to the minister. The librarian tried to create a feeling of distrust towards Madame, and asked her how well she personally understood magic, if she was making such conclusions. Vivian answered honestly that she did not know the magical laws and rules very well, but she heard and saw a lot while being close to His Highness. The librarian said that it seemed he had underestimated Madame. At this time, the Empress silently listened to their conversation and drew her own conclusions. Then she ordered the library to be tidied up, and the maids immediately began to collect the books scattered across the floor. Then the Empress approached Vivian, and the girl noticed that her face did not look very kind. Perhaps the girl went too far in daring to accuse a library employee who was directly subordinate to Her Majesty. Vivian had already regretted several times that she had not kept her mouth shut and intervened in this situation. The Empress asked why the lady was alone. As far as she knew, she had arrived here with the prince. The girl replied that the emperor had become concerned about her health, so she ended the audience early and left. The empress looked at Vivian. A person who was terminally ill must value every second of her time. She added that from now on she would keep an eye on the lady. Vivian tensed up. She didn't understand the meaning of the words spoken. It looks like she now has 2 guards who will be monitoring her every move. By this time the prince's audience was over, and he was walking down the corridor surrounded by court servants. At some point, Aslan felt a little ill after an unpleasant conversation with his father. And then someone said they smelled blood. Aslan turned around and saw Hans standing by the wall. The brother added that Aslan was looking at him as if he was ready to fight. Hans said mockingly that he was worried about his brother because he was completely saturated with the smell of blood. He added that he should not remain indifferent and simply pass by his younger brother. Hans said how Aslan could abuse the curse, do such things, and then blame the showdown on his brother. In response, the prince asked how long Hans would continue to insult the imperial family, and getting things done without getting his hands dirty is just his style. And then their conversation was interrupted. Both heard leisurely steps along the corridor. It was Vivian Eleanor. The girl came closer and said that she had a bad feeling, so she hurried here. Hans was the first to answer her, asking if everything was okay with her health. He added that if the lady had finished her business, he would be glad to see her at his palace. Aslan looked angrily at his brother and said sharply that they refused. Hans replied that he asked the lady. She would hardly refuse. She has too caring a character. But Vivian said that she had other things to do and she would visit his palace next time. And then Hans said that it seemed to him that their relationship with the prince had improved recently, which meant that she was most likely already familiar with Aslan's true appearance. Vivian was afraid that Hans could possibly guess that she had learned about Astaroth's curse. The girl understood that she had to answer something, but not a single suitable thought came to mind. Hans noticed Vivian's confusion and, smiling, said that he was just thinking of something he could talk about with her over a cup of tea. The crown prince's insolence and tactlessness knew no bounds, and this angered Vivian. But thank God he turned around and walked away, and then Vivian remembered that Aslan was standing nearby. She turned to him and said that she didn't always understand his brother's jokes. And then it seemed to Vivian that Aslan was feeling very bad. He could barely stand on his feet. And the next second, she noticed bloodstains on the prince's clothes. Aslan had to tell Vivian how his conversation with his father ended. Now the girl understood why she had such an alarming premonition. Vivian ran to the carriage for the medical kit and said that she had to do what she could and ordered the prince to take off his clothes immediately. Aslan looked at the girl and replied that his body hurt, so he would not be able to undress on his own. Vivian had no choice but to move closer to the prince and touch the first button. Aslan said that if she touched his wounds, it would hurt him a lot. Finally, the shirt was removed and Vivian saw severe bruises on the prince's body. The wounds turned out to be much more serious than Vivian had expected, and she suggested calling the court physician, but Aslan replied that her help would be sufficient. The girl disinfected the napkin and asked the prince to be patient for a little while. And then Aslan looked Vivian in the eyes and began to apologize for the fact that she now saw him as weak. The girl replied that everyone has weaknesses, and in such cases one must accept the help of others. Aslan had a difficult and lonely childhood, and it was very similar to Vivian's childhood, and this made her feel sorry for the prince. Suddenly, he extended his hand to her and asked if she would always be by his side. Aslan did not wait for an answer and hugged Vivian tightly. The girl answered in agreement. That's exactly how she should answer now. But Vivian knew that as soon as they returned to Blackford, he would become the same, strong Aslan. One night, my father left alone and there was no news from him. Everyone thought he had disappeared. Sometime later, he was found dead in the forest. The cause of death was a fall, and the funeral took place in a quiet family circle. But no one cried over the death of their father, and neither did Vivian. She just felt some kind of strange and unpleasant premonition. Brother Alex, who was supposed to return to the academy, unexpectedly inherited the title of Duke. Thanks to Aslan's help and advice, the title succession process went smoothly, and Iris was now officially accepted into the family. This was good news for everyone, but not for Vivian. She was the only one whose situation was getting worse and worse. The day before, Vivian got up as usual and began her morning preparations for breakfast. Then she looked at herself in the mirror and noticed some kind of mark on her chest. Vivian called the head maid and asked what the mark meant, but the woman replied that she could not see anything and asked her to get dressed quickly. The girl buttoned her dress and wanted to know where it came from. And then she remembered that there was a similar pattern in the novel, but it was a little different and a different color. The main character's sign was so bright that she had to wear closed dresses, and Vivian's sign was more like the one she saw on Aslan in the cave. The girl wanted to know if Aslan knew about this sign, but she could not ask the prince about it openly. Vivian approached the door of the prince's office and suddenly heard Aslan ask someone if he could keep his mouth shut, and the voice answered him that he always watches for strangers entering. Vivian carefully approached and listened as the butler asked the prince if he had really made his final decision. He added that he understood His Highness's will, but he thought it was reckless. After all, in the worst case, Madam could die. Suddenly, the butler thought that someone was standing outside the office door and eavesdropping. He walked abruptly to the doors, opened them, and looked out into the corridor, but there was no one there. Vivian stood around the corner, covering her mouth to hide her identity, unable to understand the meaning of what she had just heard. Could it be that this time the prince has decided to deal with her? Of course, Vivian didn't expect a reward for her kindness, but she couldn't imagine that Aslan would commit murder to keep the secret. The girl thought that they had become very close lately, but most likely these were just her naive thoughts. Vivian walked to the window, looked at her reflection, and decided that in any case, she had to deal with this magic circle, even if it was in secret from Aslan. Now Vivian had no choice but to go to that man. He was the great mage from the original novel who led the Mages Guild. It was he who helped the main character awaken her magical powers. Vivian knew where to find him according to the novel. Now all that was left was to wait for the right moment. The next day, the girl, accompanied by the prince, walked out of the gates of the mansion. The prince said it would be a simple walk, but he himself was armed and in full dress. Aslan added that he had rented the place in advance, and no one would be able to disturb them. It all looked like preparation for a crime, but the fact that the place they were heading to was near the Magician's Guild was reassuring. Vivian realized she wouldn't have another chance and clutched the hem of her dress tightly. The girl told the prince that she noticed a shop nearby and asked permission to go there alone. When Aslan suggested going together, Vivian pretended to be embarrassed and replied that it was a bit awkward to go there with a man. After all, this is a store of underwear and other accessories that a woman needs. The prince replied that he would wait for her at the restaurant in 20 minutes. He wanted Vivian to take the maid with her, but it was too late. The girl quickly disappeared from his sight around the corner of the street. Vivian ran so fast that when she stopped near the guild's porch, she couldn't catch her breath for a long time. She looked at the sign. The magician must definitely be somewhere here. Entering inside, Vivian did not notice anything unusual. The whole environment was ordinary, and nothing indicated that magicians could be here. Then one of the guild servants approached the girl and said that this was not the place where she could be. When he lifted his hood and looked at the stranger with his pearly lilac eyes, Vivian realized that she had come to the right place. It was that same great magician Jesus. There's no mistaking it. He might be hiding his true identity now, but Vivian knows how to fix it. The girl placed her palm on her chest and quietly sang a lullaby of the Empire about how a red moon rises at night and the devil appears. The young man removed his hood, and Vivian's eyes were blinded by a bright light. Jesus asked how the girl found this place and why she came to the Magician's Guild. Vivian asked to look at the mark that had recently appeared on her chest and tell her what it could mean. The magician replied that he already knew that there was a magic circle under the dress. The girl asked what kind of magic it was and how dangerous it was for her. Jesus leaned towards Vivian and replied that this was not just a sign, it was sinister black magic. It is so powerful that when activated, it can rip her heart apart. The magician looked at the girl and said that she reacted to his words more calmly than he expected. Vivian was screaming and hysterical inside. She was not okay. Jesus added that there is 2 encouraging news regarding getting rid of this sign. Firstly, her magic circle is complete. Black magic circles are always red, but hers is not. Vivian began to beg the magician to quickly begin the ritual of destroying this circle. But then Jesus reminded that there was a second piece of news. This magic sign suppresses fatal tuberculosis in a girl. Black magic is very jealous. It does not like when its owner dies from something other than it, but the girl can make a choice. Vivian said that she was ready to pay any amount if the magician would rid her of this black magic. Then Jesus replied that he doesn't work just for money. He took out a dagger and added that as a reward, he wanted the pure blood of a member of the Eleanor family. So, can a girl harm her own beautiful body? Vivian understood that she had come here for a specific purpose and snatched the weapon from the mage's hands. She said she had no time to hesitate and resolutely brought the dagger to her hand. The next second, she made a deep cut on her palm, and blood immediately began to ooze from the wound. Hoping that this would be enough, Vivian filled the cup with her blood, the blood of Eleanor's family. The magician looked at the brave lady and added that the contract was considered concluded. Jesus cast healing magic on the wound, and Vivian ran faster to where the prince was waiting for her. The magician said that the decryption would take a lot of time, so she would have to wait. The prince sat at a restaurant table and waited for Vivian to return. He thought that Dylan, the butler, noticed his agitation because he said that an ominous smile flashed across the prince's face. Dylan tried to reassure His Highness, as the prince had rehearsed the dance he had taught him several times at home. He had to flirtatiously twitch his shoulders, holding a rose between his lips and pretending to tease his partner. Dylan confidently added that this would definitely be a successful proposal. The prince hoped that Vivian would like the surprise he had prepared. After all, the butler, using cunning, found out about her interests in advance, so he and the prince settled on the choice of a dance. But Aslan was not worried about the dance, he was worried about something else. He remembered that Vivian still didn't want to be engaged to him, but Aslan couldn't put it off any longer. After all, even the best doctors will not be able to improve her condition, and with him, Vivian will remain alive. Therefore, there was no other way but to apply a protective magical mark on her body. After this ritual, both must share a lifespan. As long as Alan lives, Vivian will not die. Back at the mansion, Dylan warned the prince that if he himself died, then Madame would die too. Aslan himself understood this. He couldn't make such a reckless choice in a hurry, he had too many enemies. But he could no longer stand idle and wait for the medicine to be made for Vivian. So we need to get married as soon as possible. At that moment, Vivian came running and began to apologize for her long absence. Aslan replied that everything was fine and suggested that the girl sit down and catch her breath. And then he noticed with horror that there was a bandage on Vivian's left hand. The prince anxiously asked where this wound came from and why he felt some weak magic. The girl realized that she needed to somehow get out of it. She lied that on the way here some woman grabbed her and asked for help. In the process, she got a little injured, but it was nothing. The woman took care of her and bandaged her hand using healing magic. But the prince insisted that Vivian tell what exactly had happened. The girl replied that some man had danced a terrible dance for the woman, and she had asked him to hide it. Vivian added that the dancer was shrugging his shoulders in an awkward way, and then started teasing her with the rose. The girl said that she would have run away too if she had been in that woman's place. Aslan listened to Vivian and asked if what she had just told her was true. The girl laughed and replied, "Of course it's true. Why would she lie?" The prince looked at Vivian and ordered dinner to be served. The girl sighed with relief. It seemed Aslan believed her story. She asked why Dylan was grabbed and dragged somewhere. The prince replied that there were reasons for that. Today's walk, which Vivian had been dreading, turned out to be a simple, peaceful dinner. But soon an alarming wind blew towards a new event. The invitation stated that there would be a summer hunting festival organized by the Crown Prince, which would take place in the sacred forest. And the presence of the prince and Lady Eleanor will be a great joy for the imperial family. Vivian crumpled the invitation, and Crown Prince Hans finally made his move. The sacred forest is the place where the first emperor rested. Previously, this place was inaccessible to anyone except the imperial family. But this forest was endowed with anti-magic power, which meant that for Aslan, cursed by Astaroth, this was the worst place. The prince said that it would be better for Vivian to stay in the mansion, as her health could deteriorate at any moment. But the girl replied that she did not intend to miss an event in which His Highness was participating. According to the plot of the original novel, Vivian remembered that the attempt to poison the Empress took place just before the hunting festival. And it was there that Aslan, who had no alibi, was unjustly accused of this crime. Vivian could not stay away also because then she would not receive her medicine for tuberculosis. Finally, the carriage stopped and the coachman reported that they had arrived at their destination. Vivian stepped out of the carriage and immediately felt that she could breathe much easier here. Perhaps this anti-magic effect suppresses the symptoms of her illness. The first thing to do was to separate Aslan from the Empress, and the girl said that she was heading to the barracks. They would see the prince later. Then Aslan hugged Vivian and asked if she wouldn't even kiss him for good luck. The girl wanted to answer that kissing was hardly appropriate in such a crowded place, but the prince suggested looking around. Vivian saw girls kissing their men before the festival. Apparently it was a tradition here. The prince added that if he simply left now, Vivian would feel awkward, catching questioning glances. And Vivian had to do it. She turned to Aslan and kissed him on the cheek. She looked into the prince's eyes and wished him a successful hunt, as did the other couples present. Aslan kissed Vivian's hand and replied that he would thank her for her support and catch the best prey. He probably knew that this event was a trap for him, but he still decided to take part in it. They had to separate for a while, and Vivian was already approaching a large mansion that had been converted into barracks. Everyone who did not participate in the hunting competition had to be here. Hoping to see the Empress, Vivian looked around, but Her Majesty was not there yet. Suddenly she heard two ladies whispering about a certain Countess Amelia, who would also be taking part in the hunting festival this year. Vivian turned with interest in the direction where the chatty girls were looking. According to the novel's plot, it is Countess Amelia who attempts to poison the Empress. She is the very criminal who was supposed to frame Aslan. The poison was passed on to the Countess so openly that no other impudence and courage could have been expected from the Emperor's mistress. If the plot continues to develop, the Countess will have to offer Her Majesty a glass of poisoned champagne. Vivian decided to pretend to have bumped into the maid and discreetly switch the glasses. And after that, you will need to leave here quietly, quickly, and unnoticed. At this moment, everyone was invited to greet Her Majesty, and the Empress entered the hall. She appeared accompanied by Hans and was surprised to see Lady Eleanor at the hunting festival. Vivian walked up to them to greet Her Majesty and the Crown Prince. Hans asked if Vivian was also going to take part in the competition. The girl replied that she planned to stay here today, and the prince exclaimed that this was excellent. The Empress's maids are absent today due to the festival, so it would be best if Vivian spent time with his mother. The girl approached Her Majesty and said that it was a great honor for her to accompany the Empress throughout the festival. She looked at Vivian and said that the lady did not look well and ordered that the court physician be called. A few minutes later, a court physician was assigned to the girl, who was supposed to monitor her health. And the Empress added that from now on she would look after Lady Eleanor. It seems that Her Majesty decided that Vivian was taking too long to die, so she assigned a doctor to her to find out when the girl would finally leave this world. The doctor said that he should first listen to the lungs and breathing and ask the lady to come closer to him. But Vivian had no time to undergo medical procedures. Amelia had a cunning plan in her head, and at that moment she noticed how the Countess's maid was already approaching the Empress, carrying a tray of champagne. She won't be able to make a substitution when the doctor is targeting her. Vivian began frantically going through different ideas in her head to save Her Majesty. She tried to remember the plot to find a way out of this situation. At this point, Vivian suddenly snatched the sharp object from the doctor and asked what it was. And was he really going to put that thing under her clothes? The girl seemed to say this so loudly that the surrounding guests turned in their direction. It worked, and now all the attention was on them. They had to continue playing the villain role. And since she herself cannot prevent the poisoning, then someone else must do it. Vivian abruptly grabbed the maid's hand holding the tray and ordered her to hold the medical instrument. The maid tried to free herself and said that she had to take the champagne to Her Majesty the Empress. But Vivian didn't listen to her and said that her brother had ordered a special artifact for her, with the help of which she would now check if there were things nearby that were harmful to her. The audience froze in anticipation, and the girl began demonstrating her artifact on the things that were in the hands of the maid. The maid began to beg him to let her go. She had an important task, but it was impossible to persuade Vivian. The girl didn't even notice how Hans entered the hall with all this showdown. The Crown Prince came closer and asked what was going on. At that moment, everyone present noticed that the color of the artifact had changed. It had turned black. The court physician exclaimed in amazement that this could not be. These are just ordinary medical tweezers that he has been using for several years. And then Vivian said that perhaps the artifact reacted to something else, something that was nearby. She was still holding the maid's hand, and at that moment she felt it tremble. But Vivian did not want to take responsibility for accusing the girl and asked the doctor what the matter might be. The court physician looked in their direction and said that the maid seemed suspicious to him, especially that glass of champagne in her hand. Vivian replied that if the doctor insisted, she was ready to test this glass. A second later, she said that the artifact reacted to champagne in a completely different way than to tweezers. An anxious whisper was heard in the hall, wondering if there was poison in the glass, but the maid said that it was intended for the Empress. Hans said that he would personally interrogate the maid and ordered her to be taken into custody immediately. The maid cried and said that it was slander, and Vivian realized that it was time for her to leave. The poisoning situation resolved itself as if naturally, and the performance was superbly performed. Now they had to hurry, because according to the original, Aslan's magic went out of control around sunset. Vivian had to prevent the prince from entering the tomb of the first emperor. But then Vivian heard Hans's voice behind her, slyly saying that the scene with the artifact looked amazing. The girl pretended not to understand the crown prince, but he added that he admired her determination and courage. After all, the lady not only prevented the poisoning attempt, but also played it off as an accident, giving credit to others and modestly leaving. Vivian put on an innocent face and began to stupidly apologize to His Highness. But Hans said she had nothing to apologize for, and a lady like Vivian was too good for Aslan. The girl asked the crown prince to explain his words, but he simply turned away. Vivian didn't want to continue this unpleasant conversation any longer, and she quickly ran out into the street. Hans watched her go and thought that if she was heading to Aslan, she would soon learn something. Learns that the prince is merely prey at this hunter's festival. At some point, Aslan felt very ill and grabbed his chest. He couldn't control the magic due to contact with the shrine. Aslan thought he had carefully prepared for the anti-magic action, but he had not expected that they would use the sword of the first emperor. The prince galloped at full speed and wondered if Hans really wanted to catch him that badly. At some point, Aslan realized that he could no longer restrain himself. He jumped off his horse and fell to the ground. The prince decided that it would be best to hide now, since he could no longer ride anyway. The prince looked around and saw a fork in the road. One of the roads went deep into the forest, while the second road led straight to the emperor's tomb. He remembered very well that only direct descendants of the imperial family were allowed to enter there. But Aslan had no other choice, and he, with difficulty moving his legs, headed towards the tomb. If he fails to withstand the tomb's anti-magic effects, he will become a wandering demon for a long time. The prince remembered Vivian. She was probably already waiting for his quick return. But he will have to stay in the forest. This is the only way out now. He left footprints on the wet path, the tracks gradually turning into animal paw prints. Vivian found a horse and was already racing to where Aslan might be. She was in a hurry. The sun would soon set, but the prince was nowhere to be seen. If everything goes according to the novel's plot, something irreparable might happen. Aslan can turn into a black lion right before the eyes of his subordinates. In this case, he will have only one thing left to do: deal with his subordinates. Vivian imagined the terrible picture and realized that she had to prevent this tragedy. The next moment, Vivian noticed something on the ground and immediately stopped her horse. The tracks were almost erased, but the girl could discern when the human boot suddenly became the paws of a predatory animal. The girl stopped for a moment. The tracks led to the tomb of the first emperor. At that moment, Aslan's life was more important than anything else, and Vivian, without thinking, rushed along that path. Vivian rushed to the right place and noticed that the structure was very fundamental. If Aslan is here, then he has probably already turned into a demonic beast and lost his mind. The girl looked around and realized that she needed to be careful. And suddenly, in the darkness of the bushes, she heard some rustling and became alert. Through the dense thickets of bushes, the red eyes of the beast looked at her. The next second, Vivian saw the huge, bared mouth of a predator that rushed at her. The girl closed her eyes in fear. Was she really going to be eaten alive now? A second later, Vivian opened her eyes. She was alive. And next to her stood a huge black lion. And then the predatory beast behaved like a little puppy. He rolled over onto his back, exposing his belly. This is exactly how pets behave when they want to be petted. At that moment, Vivian realized that her ability to tame wild animals had worked. The girl sat down next to the animal, began to stroke its belly, and realized that she was saved. Suddenly it started to rain, and Vivian looked up at the storm clouds. The girl looked at the lion and realized that he was looking towards the imperial tomb. She said that entry there was prohibited to everyone except the imperial family. Perhaps the lion simply wanted to take shelter from the rain, but the sacred power there is even more powerful, and Aslan could get even worse. Vivian wanted to look for another shelter, but then the beast pulled out a sword and rushed towards the imperial tomb. The girl wanted to stop him, but it was useless. Vivian had no choice but to follow the black lion. Going inside, the girl found a torch and lit it. She said they would come in for a few minutes and then come right back out. Vivian could not have imagined that she would see the place she had read about in the novel. She felt some kind of warmth filling the tomb. The girl reached the main door and touched it. This was the main burial chamber of the imperial tomb. And then she heard the beast's menacing growl and turned around. Vivian looked at the lion and saw blood in his bared mouth. Aslan's condition was getting worse with every second. Neither she nor the prince should have come here. The girl knelt before the lion and said that they had better leave the tomb immediately. He seemed unable to move on his own, and Vivian offered to lean on her, and then the beast accidentally touched the girl's leg with its claws and injured her. It seemed that at that moment the beast was asking her for forgiveness. Vivian said it was nothing, the wound could be healed with magic. It looked like the lion was trying to use his last strength to get up and not harm the girl, and Vivian tried to encourage the beast. Just a little more and they would leave this place. Aslan wanted to get closer to the girl and hug her with his strong paw, but everything was swimming before his eyes. In this state, the prince could have hurt Vivian. The lion turned sharply and rushed into the depths of the imperial tomb. Vivian shouted that it was dangerous, but the beast seemed to be in a panic and did not listen to her. The girl and the black lion were unable to escape the watchful eyes of Crown Prince Hans's men. Vivian ran inside the tomb and looked around cautiously. She looked up and saw the coat of arms, but from the outside the girl definitely didn't feel anything like that. But then Vivian began to feel an ominous feeling. Moreover, this coat of arms carved on the ceiling of the tomb was the symbol of Eleanor's family. This coat of arms symbolized the sword that defeated the devil and was a sign of honor. It was granted to the founder of the Eleanor family, who was a companion of the first emperor. It seems that even after death, the emperor wanted to be closer to his comrade. Vivian felt her heart clench, perhaps just because she was close to the grave. Then she heard leisurely, heavy steps behind her. The girl turned around and, seeing Aslan, was glad that she didn't have to look for him. She said it was too stuffy in here and they should go outside. And the next second, the lion bared his teeth and rushed towards Vivian. The girl cowered in fear and closed her eyes, but the beast jumped and growled loudly. His target was not Vivian, but those of Hans's men who entered the tomb after them. They drew their weapons to grab the enraged lion and at the same time defend themselves from the beast's sharp fangs. Vivian turned around and realized that these were Hans's men who had come here to carry out his orders. So they tracked her and the lion and she didn't notice. The situation was similar to the one in the cave, but there was one difference. This time Vivian had a sword with her, and without a second's hesitation, Vivian hastened to put the weapon to use. Hans's men were perplexed. They could not even imagine that a fragile, sick girl could wield a sword so expertly. One of them shouted that there should be no witnesses left and ordered that the woman be killed. But Vivian held her position and parried one blow after another. Now she understood that Hans was afraid of his brother because Aslan had the power to resurrect the devil, and if he is killed, he himself will become the next heir to the curse. It seems that Hans wants to turn Aslan into a living dead person using magic and then lock him in a dungeon. But Aslan has done nothing wrong. He does not crave the throne or anything else. He simply founded Blackford with his associates. Aslan didn't want power or money. It was a fight for survival. Within minutes, the men sent by Crown Prince Hans were finished off. Vivian walked up to the Black Lion and made sure that he had calmed down a little. The girl already understood that Aslan was stubborn and no longer insisted on leaving the tomb as quickly as possible, especially since it was raining outside. In any case, Vivian will stay with him. Suddenly, the girl felt that she became very ill, and the next second she fell to the floor unconscious. Aslan looked at Vivian with fear and calmed down. It seemed she was just very tired and fell asleep. He lay down next to her. Apparently they would have to spend the night here tonight. The girl muttered something. Aslan listened. Vivian dreamed that she was bragging to her brother Alex that she had tamed a lion. The prince leaned over her and kissed her tenderly. It seemed that Vivian was not destined to boast about this. The curse had lifted earlier than Aslan thought, and this is thanks to the strong and resilient Vivian. So many things had happened, but she still hadn't given up on him and was still there. Despite her bravery, Vivian was so small and fragile for the prince that he was afraid to hurt her. Now Aslan considered himself selfish. He hid the truth from the girl and caused her pain. He leaned over Vivian and quietly said that he wanted to receive from her not only trust and respect, but also her heart. The prince knew that one day he would have to part with Vivian. She shouldn't be with a monster like him, but he couldn't bring himself to let the girl go. The next morning, Vivian needed to return to the barracks urgently. She caught herself thinking that she had slept well on the cold stone floor, as if she were lying on a soft feather bed. Vivian arrived at the scene, but Aslan was nowhere to be found. He was not there when she woke up in the tomb. Vivian was worried about whether he was okay, since his body had not yet healed from the wounds he received. Then she saw the prince and wanted to ask him about his health, but immediately closed her mouth, because she must not pretend that she did not know about the Black Lion and what happened to him. The prince saw a bloody wound on the girl's thigh and asked if everything was okay. Vivian replied that she most likely fell and didn't notice that she was injured. The girl asked if he knew how to use healing magic to heal her wound. Aslan replied that he would definitely learn, but now he had something else. The prince tore off a piece of the hem of his robe and began to bandage Vivian's wound. Although this was a temporary measure, the prince did it carefully and cautiously. He will never know that it was he who inflicted this wound when he was in the form of a lion and attacked Hans's people. And then Aslan grabbed Vivian on his back and said that he would carry her to his temporary shelter. The girl whispered in his ear that they could just ride a horse. But the prince replied that he had lost her, he was also human, and could also make mistakes. And for some reason, when he's around Vivian, he does even more of them. Aslan apologized for making her look for him and wander through the forest. But the girl did not blame the prince because this curse was to blame for everything. The prince said that he was carefully guarding a secret that she might not even know about, so he was late and made Vivian worry. The girl replied that everyone can have a secret, and if the prince doesn't want to, he doesn't have to tell about it. She added that if you hide it long enough, a lie can become the truth. Aslan replied that she was speaking strange words, as if she knew about his secret. Vivian was afraid that she might have said something unnecessary. And in order to change the subject of the conversation, the girl asked to speed up their pace, because they were almost there. Finally, Aslan approached the walls of his house, where he was staying during the festival. He put Vivian to bed and ordered the local doctor to be called immediately. The girl looked around, of course. These were not the barracks where she had initially spent time. The prince saw her look and said that this was the house where they stayed together. But if Vivian doesn't return to the barracks, her brother will start worrying about her and will start looking for her. But the bed was so soft and comfortable, truly worthy of an imperial family. Vivian asked if they would really live together in this room all week, wash and change clothes together. Aslan replied that he could not allow such a fragile girl to remain living in the barracks. But if Vivian is not comfortable, he can sleep on the sofa. The girl thought that the prince could enjoy all this comfort alone, but he decided to share it all with her, caring about her condition. Vivian felt a little awkward and asked if perhaps the prince wanted to take a bath. Aslan replied that she should not worry about him, but rather get comfortable and rest. This room would be large enough to accommodate both of them, and he, in turn, would not cause Vivian any trouble. The prince asked that if she felt uncomfortable, she would definitely tell him about it. He lay down very close and their lips almost touched when screams were heard behind the door. A man's voice shouted that he would ask His Highness everything himself. The voice that belonged to Dylan, the prince's assistant, tried to stop him, but he told him to get out of his way. The next second, the door swung open and Alex ran into the room, shouting that Vivian had really refused. The girl was perplexed. She did not understand what kind of refusal they were talking about. And then Aslan said that he would now explain everything to her. The prince admitted that he had been secretly preparing a proposal to Vivian and was supposed to dance this dance with a rose in his mouth. Apparently, Dylan asked Alex, as the girl's brother, for advice to find out her preferences and then recommended this dance to the prince. Vivian looked at Aslan and said that she really had to endure this greatest shame in the history of the Empire. Dylan tried to say that it was not his fault, but Vivian had already told her brother to take her to the barracks. The prince looked at Dylan and said that he had put up with this for too long and had turned a blind eye to it. It was the morning of the 4th day of the hunting festival, and the Empress was quietly having breakfast in her chambers. Hans took a cup of tea and told his mother that she looked very pleased. The Empress looked at her son and replied that her mood today was truly excellent. She took a sip and added that she had finally gotten rid of that thorn in Amalia's side. Her impudence knew no bounds if the Countess decided to openly carry out this matter of poisoning her. But Amalia's plan collapsed thanks to Lady Eleanor's insight. At first, the Empress thought that Vivian was just an impudent girl who was hiding behind her family's name. Therefore, she forwarded to Aslan the marriage proposal that had come to Hans. But who would have thought that Vivian would be so talented and educated, and now she seems like a suitable candidate for the role of Crown Princess? Hans replied that he was glad that Lady Eleanor had pleased his mother. Here the Empress said that she had heard about a doctor from another country who had managed to find a cure for consumption. Hans replied that he had already contacted him. The mother smiled faintly and added that this news would certainly please Lady Eleanor. She told her son to try to make friends with her family. The Empress turned to one of the maids and ordered Lady Eleanor to be brought here, showing her due respect. Vivian, hearing about the Empress's invitation, was very surprised and immediately remembered the original novel. The day was declared an unofficial rest day at the hunting festival, but according to the novel's plot, she already knew something. It was time for a fake doctor to appear who could cure consumption. It was the greatest scam in the history of the empire. Then the main character was in complete despair when she learned about the deception. She even tried to take out her anger on the innocent Iris by attempting to take her life. In the end, the heroine did not die of consumption, she was killed by Aslan. And now it's that last plot when Vivian was still alive. She managed to change a lot in the novel, and the girl knew that Aslan would no longer kill her. Suddenly someone touched Vivian's shoulder and she jumped in surprise. It was Aslan. He said he called her, but Vivian didn't answer. The prince added that he knew that the Empress had invited her. It seemed that Aslan was really worried about Vivian now, and it was evident in his gaze. Of course, she still continued to be offended by the prince for wanting to make her such a stupid proposal. But it was resentment, not anger. Vivian had a strong character and was not going to forgive Aslan right away. And then the prince said that he was ready to fulfill any of her wishes. He is ready to do everything to make Vivian forgive him. And then the girl realized, he said that he would fulfill any of her wishes. This was the chance of a lifetime.